All right, so without further ado, let me just quickly introduce our speaker today, Rich Halverson. He is from the Education Leadership and Policy Analysis Department in the School of Education. He's also the co-founder of GLS, Games, Learning, and Society. I wrote this whole introduction, and then I left it in my office. So the things that I remember from that, other than his interesting research that he's doing, is that he's an avid fantasy game player. Fantasy baseball. I don't know if you do fantasy football, but fantasy everything. He lives in a fantasy world sometime. So he's going to be talking today this morning about some of his thoughts on digital media and learning, kind of setting the foundation to remind us all that what we're doing, there actually is evidence that this stuff works. Rich, thanks.
Okay, this is one of the games that's sort of setting the standard now for what a learning game might look like in the contemporary entertainment world. Spore is a game that is based on, it's sort of a simulation of evolution, except if you think about it, evolution would be really hard to simulate and not very fun, right? You'd make a million different variations, and then you'd have a comet crash into the earth, and all of them would die except the one that happened to be stuck under the leaf over there. Right? It's not a very compelling form of gameplay. This is creationist science that's being demonstrated. In Spore, you take a little organism. Do we run out of space here? Oh no, we're about to hatch one. You take a little organism and then you modify it with the features that you want it to have, and then you follow that organism as it goes from a little single cell organism to a multicellular organism to a land creature to a communicating creature to one that can navigate space and explore the galaxies. And the interesting thing about Spore, I think, is that it's graphically very engaging. Just look at the simplicity of the interface. There's hardly anything that you have to read in order to figure out what to do in this game. It sort of scaffolds you right through the game. But the interesting thing, if you're not familiar with contemporary video games, is that Spore includes almost all of the dominant game genres in the game itself. There's real-time strategy games. There's first-person shooter games. There's civilization modeling games built into the sequence of the activities inside of Spore. So one of the issues that I'll talk about today about gaming and digital literacy is that games really are a form of a new kind of literacy, a digital literacy, that is text-based, to be sure, but also depends upon the manipulation of graphics and images in online communities as forms of communication that are not confined to text. And one of the things that I find when I talk with audiences about games and learning is just the utter dumbfoundedness of folks who've never played games like this one. They seem like, the perceptions of people that people have of games are almost always shaped by images from the outside. When you take out examples from Grand Theft Auto, or you take out examples from World of Warcraft, and you tie them to things like school violence, or you take out examples of how pornography dominates the internet, and Second Life for that matter. You take out those images, but if you're not a participant in those media, then you don't know what folks are talking about. Engaging yourself in a game like Spore is a really good example of how you can get inside the literacy and figure out what are people talking about with games and literacy. But I have a feeling in this crowd I'm sort of talking to the converted already. Let me get to my presentation here. As Steve said, my name is Rich Halverson. I am a now associate, and very happy about it, professor in the School of Education, and one of the co-founders of the Games Learning Society Research Group. And my department is in Ed Leadership, which means I don't really think about gaming for kids very much at all. My research in games is mainly about how you adapt game design principles to the requirements of adult learning, and trying to figure out how can you structure adult learning so that it borrows some of the principles of game design. And Steve mentioned the evidence idea right in his first remarks. I don't have much evidence yet. The kind of evidence that you would require, that contemporary accounts would require for games and learning, would basically mean how do games produce the kinds of learning goals that we already care about? And the sad answer to that question is that they're not very good at it. The good answer is that games are really complex dynamic systems that agents can navigate to figure out what the games themselves are about. Right? When you play a game, you learn about the game. You learn about what the systems and the characters and the quests that are inside the game. But we haven't really figured out yet how to do transfer from in-game learning to out-of-game learning. A lot of the work of the Games Learning Society Research Group is to figure out how do we construct what are called these third spaces, where you communicate the learning that happens inside of a game or a simulation outside of the game in terms of other kinds of learning goals. But that's an out-of-game experience. Dan Norton is here today from Filament Games, and Dan has been working with Filament to try to figure out exactly this problem, is how do you create games that meet external learning goal needs. And Dan, are you going to talk today, or are you just a visitor? So Dan is a person that if you're interested in building simulations specifically about science learning, he's a person that you should talk to as the day progresses. Today I'm going to talk about I want to say a little bit about GLS, about what we do. Part of our research agenda is learning from games, and part of our research agenda is building games for learning. Right? So, and we have 4 members in our group now, and we've been working since about 2004 trying to explore this area of games and learning. Today I'm going to talk about 2 basic ideas. First of all, how games are tackling and expanding conventional content and genres. When video games first broke out, like in the early 1990s, not so much the Pac-Man, not the arcade type games, but really immersive video games, ones that require 1 to 30 hours to 1 million hours to play, right? They sort of spawned genres onto themselves. And it's sort of part of the jargon of the gaming world to talk about real-time strategy games or first-person shooter games. Now I think what we're seeing in the late part of the first decade of the 21st century is games trying to tackle more conventional narrative and learning genres. And as we see with the single most important contributions that games make to conventional genres is interactivity. Right? Games provide complex dynamic systems that people can interact with. In some senses, some of the games that I'll show you today are very much like conventional narratives. But in other senses, they're completely unlike conventional narratives. Most conventional narratives have an arc that flows all the way through, where the author writes in the role of the protagonist and follows the protagonist all the way through a complex story. Games let you be the protagonist, which both flattens the narrative in interesting ways and expands the range of the narrative in interesting ways that are totally unlike any other kinds of narrative that we've developed. So I'll talk a little bit about how games are tackling and expanding conventional content, but then also how games really belong to a species of things called the new digital literacies. And some folks at MIT, Henry Jenkins and his research group, have really talked a lot about this. There's a paper that I'll share with you later, a report that was sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation that really sort of maps the domain of what the new digital literacies look like. So the new frontier of gaming. Games are expanding beyond our initial genre limitations. You saw the demo that I put up a little while ago about Spore. Spore has been a game that's been in the design since at least 2003. Spore was designed by the people who gave us The Sims, SimCity. Though